Hi, welcome to Connect.Tech. We're going to talk about Redux, the MVC framework for data. Come join us. Here's the part where I tell you I'm definitely going to post the slides on my site tonight. You're going to look tonight, tomorrow, next week, next month. In about 3 months, you'll get tired of waiting for me to post my slides and my code, and you'll email me. In about 6 months, I'll reply and say, no, I'm definitely going to post them on my site tonight, and I'll never post them at all. Which is why you can go to robrich.org right now, and you can click on presentations here at the top, and you'll see Redux, the MVC framework for data, right here at the top of the list. From there, you can click into not only the slides that we're going to look at today, but also the code that is online right now. So you'll have all of the resources to be able to replicate these demos and to view the slides online right now. While you're here at robrich.org, click on About Me and you'll get to this site, which talks about some of the things that I've done recently. I'm a Microsoft MVP, a friend of Redgate. AZ GiveCamp is wonderful. AZ GiveCamp brings volunteer developers together with charities who otherwise couldn't afford software services. We start building software for them Friday after work. Sunday afternoon, we deliver that completed software back to the charities. Sleep is optional, caffeine provided. If you're in Phoenix, come join us for the next AZ GiveCamp. Or if you'd like philanthropy installed in your area, ask for a GiveCamp by email or by Twitter. Click the email button right here. And let's get philanthropy installed in your area as well. Some of the other things that I've done, SQL Source Control Basics, mine is Chapter 8. That was a lot of fun. I was on the Gulp core contributor team in version 2 and version 3. So I helped shape that library. That was really fun. The thing that I'm most proud of is that I replied to a .NET Rocks podcast episode. They read my comment on the air. And they sent me a mug. Woohoo! So there's my claim to fame, my coveted .NET Rocks mug. So let's talk about Flux, the MVC framework for data. As we look at, we talked about this guy. As we look at frameworks, we can look at how these frameworks help us to make complex things more palatable. How we can route data through these patterns to be able to get predictable results. And the Flux pattern in Redux is no different. So, the MVC pattern. The MVC pattern is a well-known pattern of being able to take requests and map them into responses. A user will take an action, they'll do something with their HTTP page, it will make an HTTP request, that request will go through a router. The router takes the details of the request, probably the URL and the HTTP method, and chooses a controller. The controller then does some stuff. It may reach out to the database, it may do some calculations, and it collects some data. It will pass that data to the Vue. The Vue then renders out the HTML or the JSON and returns that as the HTTP response to the user. So the user can take an action, go to a router, that goes to a controller, that goes to a Vue, back to a response, and back to the user. This circular pattern is a really elegant way to process web requests. At each step in this process, we can make decisions. So perhaps if we're not authenticated, the router can hand us to a different controller. Or perhaps based on the data that we find, the controller can hand us to a different Vue. Well, what did we have before this? Well, the user would make a request and we would go to a page. That page would render some stuff and we would have a response. There wasn't really any difference between the URL that the user had requested and the response that they got. Maybe there was some differences in the content in the response, but we wouldn't get wildly different responses. We might redirect in interesting ways, but for the most part, one URL meant one page, meant one response. Now this is a simpler architecture, but it yields us less options. With the MVC pattern, if the request isn't authenticated, the router could make different choices to go to a different router. Or maybe based on the controller could render a view based on the results that it has, or maybe it's going to return JSON directly to the response. These are choices that the router and the controller and the Vue can make to yield different results. We've created this pattern of abstraction to be able to handle the complexity of these choices. These layers of indirection allow us options. Now we definitely could go back to one URL equals one page if we didn't need that complexity, but if we do need those levels of indirection, the MVC pattern is a really elegant way to contain this paradigm. In a similar way, so the simpler strategy is definitely fine when we don't have that complex use case, but when we do, the MVC pattern is perfect. Let's look at the flux pattern. Now the flux pattern has kind of been embodied in Redux, though in Vue we have VueX, and in Angular we have RxData or NGRX. Now the library itself, the Ajax library, doesn't do any of this, but it's that flux pattern that gives us this metaphor that allows us to create layers of abstraction and indirection in places where we need it. So here's that flux pattern. The user does something. Maybe they click a button. Maybe they type in data in a field. That calls an action. And an action will do something. It'll dispatch data. Now it dispatches data. The dispatch system then goes through one or more reducers. And the reducer then commits data into the store. The store being that stateful object that contains the current value of all of the pieces. The store then may have one or more subscribers that listen for that data. That will render some components, and ultimately the user will be able to see their results. So this circular pattern is a lot like the MVC pattern. The user does something that triggers an action. An action will dispatch into reducers. The first reducer to yield the result will get that data into the store. The store then may have subscribers that render data back to users. This circular Redux pattern allows us layers of indirection so that we can make choices when different types of data process in different ways. We're no longer stuck to one request equals one response or one user click equals one visual result. Well, what did we have without this? Well, we had a mechanism of prop drilling. So let's examine this blue dot, and let's pretend that this blue dot is the one that has a change. Well, this one has to tell its parent component, and that has to tell its parent component, and it has to tell its parent component, and then the parent components have to re-render the children, and and so you end up passing a lot of props around, not because each component needs it, but because child components may need it or may need to broadcast it. This mechanism of prop drilling can make components kind of complex. Now ultimately, all of these, this head of the tree is the one responsible for all of the data in that set, which means this one is the one that contains the state, and all the rest of them have these props that may or may not be related to what this component is trying to do. So we have this mechanism that is starting to get overly complex, and let's add flux. When we add flux, in this case Redux to a React application, then we have a store. Now provider provides this store to all the components. Each component can then broadcast things into the store or subscribe to things from the store. So perhaps they will broadcast an action, like this blue component is broadcasting an action. And then other components can choose to subscribe to that data change. So they'll subscribe to the store, and as that action yields a dispatch that mutates the store, then the subscribers will get called with that new data. Maybe the parent component doesn't even know that this data is passing around, and that is perfect. With Redux, with this flux pattern, we've created a mechanism where we can yield these layers of indirection to make our components simpler. Now this layer of indirection doesn't come without consequence, so in places where we do want that simplicity, prop drilling may be perfect. So for example, if we have a local scenario where maybe we only have a property that is associated with one component, or maybe just with a few components, then local state may be perfect for this, because all the rest of the components don't need to subscribe to it. The flux pattern, Redux, is great for shared mutable state. If we only have local state, using the local state mechanisms is probably easier. So Redux is for shared mutable state. I kind of like this quote. This was said by me right now. Redux is for shared mutable state. If you don't have shared mutable state, then you want to keep that state somewhere else. You want to probably keep it in local state. If you only have a few components that need that state, leave it in local state and don't pollute the global state. So benefits of Redux. We can centralize the business logic around data evolution. We can allow many subscribers to react to data changes. We can separate the data storage from the component tree. In particular, hot module replacement is really powerful here. The moment we've separated the data from the rendering of that data, we can replace the components that render the data and then just play the data back into place. That's really powerful. That can make debugging a lot faster. But you probably don't need Redux if you only have a single component, or you have a small group of components, or you have only a few prop observers. It might make sense to keep some local state and maybe pass it into one or two components as props if you only have local pieces that you need to change. So, Redux, how it works. Let's dig in. Well, with Redux, the hardest part is getting started. And the bummer part is you need all of those pieces before anything works. You need actions, you need dispatch, you need reducers, you need the store, you need getters, you need all of these pieces in place before you can really use any of them. Bummer, but it's not that bad to build them up. Here's those pieces. We need to create some actions. Dispatch is handled by Redux. We need some reducers, we need the store, we need subscribers, and we need to build those four pieces before anything really does anything. We'll probably need to hook them up in interesting places as well. We'll need to get our code to call actions, and we'll need to get our code to subscribe to events. Okay, so let's dig into getting started with Redux. Now, the first stage is indeed weird. Here's our reducer. Now our reducer will take in the state, the thing that we want to change, and the action. Or actually the state, our store, and the action, the thing we want to do. Now we can switch on action.type and take a look at the data that we want to mutate. Now reducers must be synchronous because we're returning the new store. We're mutating this store based on this reducer. So the first reducer that says, yep, I'm the answer, I'm going to mutate it, that's the one that wins. All of the reducers get called, and the first one to reply saying, I've got the answer, that's the one that happens. So here's our hello reducer here in the reducers folder, hello reducer. And we've got this index reducer that will combine all of our reducers together. Now we have a single nested reducer. That's pretty sweet. Here's our store. Our store, this is a lot of code, but it's mostly just copy and pasted from the last example. I have some middleware that will do some interesting things, like hot module replacement. Thunk is a mechanism of making functions and functions. That allows me to move my dispatch into my actions, if I'd like, rather than having to dispatch from my components. That's pretty cool. So for the most part, next project, I just copy and paste this code, and it works just fine. So here's some actions to kick that off. Say hello. I'll take in the value that I want to say hello, and because I did thunk, I return this function that takes in a dispatch, so now I can dispatch this. The dispatch will end up going through all the reducers. This reducer yields this spot where I get this particular reducer. I'm taking that action. Here's that hello world. I'm going to then mutate my state to grab the payload out of that and set it into value. And now my components get the results of this. Say hello is the method that kicks it off, and then I can just listen in the components. Now there is one piece that I need to rig up in my application, the provider. Now this provider allows the store to be available on all components. So any component that wants to reach into this.store has this.store. They don't need to do, or this.props.store. they don't need to reach into all of the other places. This .props.store gets passed in automatically because this provider yields it to everybody. Now I may choose to also provide routers or other things, and so this provider section may get pretty intense. But that's the one piece that I need to do in Redux, is to rig up the store to get it provided as this .props.store. So now I have a hello world component that will do some interesting things. Let's take a look at that hello world component. Here's that hello world component. I've got it pulled up right here, and I can dispatch some things. Hello world. I'm going to say hello, and it's going to go through that process. So the hello world component, when I get a submit on my form, we'll call handle submit. Handle submit here will dispatch this hello world event. I get the payload from my input control, and that will head off to this reducer. So now I've got this action. There's my hello world payload that gets stuck in the value property. And now that I've got my reducer set in place, I can subscribe to that event, and in this case, I'm just saying store state.hello.value. Now I got store state actually by grabbing store.getState. So I've made that loop. I submit my value. It goes to a reducer. Dispatch sends that to, or I trigger my action. Dispatch sends that to my reducer. I'm getting my state from that subscriber and then rendering it back on my page. And so I type hello Connect.Tech, and there we go. Hello Connect.Tech. That was pretty cool. So now obviously this app is not complex enough to require Redux, but it's a great way to start to experiment with it. Let's experiment a little bit more. So right now we have all of these things running in one component. Yeah, we really don't need it to be that complex. Let's look at this connect mechanism. So here's this connect component. And this connect component has two things, eventer and subscriber. Eventer and subscriber know nothing about each other, and we're not sending any props to either. That's perfect, because now our parent component doesn't need to keep track of the things that go between them. So eventer. Now let's scroll down here to the bottom, and we will look at this connect mechanism. Redux provides connect, React Redux provides connect to be able to connect our store into our components. It takes in two properties, state to props and dispatch to props. So here in state to props, we'll have the things that we want to do for our getters. Dispatch to props is how we trigger our actions. So subscribers, dispatchers, or getters, and posters, senders, are actions. We'll connect these things, and then that will get us a higher order component that we can pass our regular component into to make a new higher order component that is rigged up with all of the things. So state to props, in this case, we're not passing in any, but dispatch to props, we're passing in send message. Here's that send message. So when we call submit, we will call send message with the input. Well, how does send message work? Let's come over here to our action. Here's that send message action. It takes in that message, and because we've got thunk, now we can dispatch that action. Let's do connect, and we'll send in that message. So what are our reducers listening to that? Well, here's a reducer that will listen for do connect, and if it finds that do connect action type, then it'll mutate the message from the passed in message. That's perfect. Flipping over to our subscriber, here's our subscriber. Now our subscriber does a similar thing. It connects using React Redux, state to props and dispatch to props. In this case, it doesn't need to dispatch, it's only a listener. And so state to props, it's going to go grab the connection. Now we're spreading the connect the state object to go grab this one so that we can pass in this connection as our list of new props. And now we have the props, and we can just go props.connection.message. So when I broadcast this, broadcast, then I'll send that message, and that message gets broadcast across. That's perfect. Send things. I'm triggering this, not there, eventer. I'm triggering this dispatch. It's going through this action. It's going through this reducer. Nope, it's going through this reducer. And it's yielding on this prop, this subscriber, back to the new component. So now we kind of see how those two things combine together, where we've got different pieces in different components. Well, how would we do this asynchronously? So for example, if we're going to do an AJAX request, hello from AJAX. Let's make that AJAX call and see how it goes. So if we look at this AJAXify component, as I push submit on my component, now I'm going to go create this request object, this request body, and call AJAX start. Now AJAX start, I bound that in the same way. Here's that AJAX start in dispatch to props. AJAX start comes here from my actions AJAX. Here's my actions AJAX. Here's AJAX start. Now this is an asynchronous message, and reducers must be synchronous. So here I'm going to do all of my asynchrony in this AJAX start method. So I'm going to wait post AJAX, and then if I succeed, I'll call success, and if I fail, I'll call fail. Well, this success and fail are these actions down here, and I've separated them out as separate methods so that I can call them separately. That's perfect. I pass in my message to this services AJAX, and services AJAX is just a mechanism of doing a fetch request. Once that fetch request comes back, then I'll call these results, and these results are the ones that are going to yield that type. So here's type AJAX success and AJAX fail. Now I'm choosing to dispatch them straight away. So now that I've got these dispatched, here in my reducers, I have AJAX start, AJAX success, and AJAX fail to be able to populate all of the properties of my initial state. So as I do this, let's choose to fail this time. Failing, make an AJAX call. It does all the asynchronous things, and we see we have AJAX success, AJAX start, and AJAX fail. All the events are there, allowing us to mutate it at the various points of our asynchronous process. And that yields us nicely into the Redux dev tools. Redux dev tools are really helpful in being able to see the things that we did. So during AJAX success, we changed loading from true to false. Or from AJAX start, we changed loading from false to true. In AJAX success, we changed it from true to false. And we changed our response to that message that we needed to send into it. Now, if we're doing this AJAX start, again, we change it from false to true. And then here's AJAX fail, where we send loading true to false, and our message goes to null, and success to false. Now what's interesting is we can do time travel debugging, where we can move through time. You notice how the components are changing based on the state of these processes. So as we walk through the processes, we can see the impact that they have. Hot module replacement allows us to make these changes and walk through our events again, making sure that our new components behave in the way that we expect. That is perfect. So what can go wrong? Well, here in this React app is the failinator, and we've outlined some mechanisms where things can fail. Let's pop open the failinator component. Here in the failinator component, we have a couple of buttons that will do bad things. Handle misnamed. Okay, so handle misnamed will call into, we have dispatch to props, and here's this misnamed. Misnamed came from our actions fails. Okay, so actions fails. Here's misnamed. Misnamed sends in the action type missing reducer. Okay, so let's head over to our reducers for fails. And apparently here we did a typo. We misspelled reducer, maybe we did. So it's going to fall through each of these. It's going to find no matches. And it's not going to change the state at all. The bummer part is, visually, we just know it didn't work. But there's one of the places where things can easily fall off the rails, is if we don't have a reducer matching our action type. Next up, we have another fail mechanism. Here's our failinator component, handle prop fail. Handle prop fail will come in here. Here's this prop fail. Prop fail gets called here. Here's prop fail coming in from our actions. So let's go to fails and look for prop fail. So it's going to dispatch prop fail. That's perfect. And in our reducers, if we come into fails, here is prop fail, and we're setting prop fail to true. Okay, so everything looks like it works. We do have an action matching our reducer. We do have a standard chain of going all the way through. So now let's look for our prop fail back here in our failinator component. Well, we're binding to fails. And fails is the state that we have. And inside the fails state, in here in our reducers, we're setting prop fail as one of the props here. Failinator is looking for fails.badProps. Ooh! So we set prop fail in our store. We listen for bad props in our component, and so it's just gonna not work. But it's not super obvious why. Let's go through our next component, next failure condition, handle too many. So handle too many, we pull in too many from our actions. Actions come in from here. Here's our too many action. And here we're going to kick off the action type double reducer. Spoiler alert. Here we have a double reducer setting it to 1 and a double reducer setting it to 2. Well, which one gets called? If we think through this code, if it's this, it'll return. If it's this, it'll return. If it's this, so it will get set to 1 all the time. So if I have my breakpoint right here and I'm waiting for my action to get hit, it just won't get hit and I'll get the wrong value. Not because I coded it wrong, but because there's some other action listening. It's really easy as these files get bigger or as I start to separate them into multiple files to end up with components that are reducers that may do the same job twice. So we saw a bunch of failure conditions, and unfortunately, it looks like everything's working. It just, the UI isn't changing. What's up with that? So these are some of the failure conditions that we can look for. Now ultimately, the Flux pattern is great when we need shared central state. If we need to share state between components in kind of a global way, then the Flux pattern will be great. In React, use Redux. In Vue, use VueX. In Angular, use RxData. All of these implement the Flux pattern and they work in the same way. For local state, you don't need Redux. That's too complex. Instead, use the local state mechanisms, and we saw some of that in the components that we looked at today as well. Thanks for coming to Connect.Tech. I'll be in the standard place where we have questions and answers for the conference, or if you'd like to reach out to me on Twitter, grab me at rob_rich, or send me an email from robrich.org. The slides and code are available on robrich.org right now. Dive in. Let's start learning.